Мы познакомились с Биткоин-магазином в основном на почве того, что мы одновременно решили проводить митапы про биткоин и раз в месяц собираться и обсуждать контекст истории, технологию, и собираться с друзьями и вот это все обсуждать. Приходит раз в месяц 60 человек где-то. Скоро тоже будет еще один. Вы тоже приходите. Обычно моя главная цель – это разговаривать не на змеином языке. И сейчас мы тоже попробуем поговорить про будущее биткоина. Я думаю, что будет нормально. И всем постараемся интересным. We gotta start now. So, Peter came from I don't know where. I know him as a person living everywhere, but he was in Bitcoin for a long time. And when they asked me how to announce him, I told it's like an influential developer because he doesn't code much, I guess, but he has an opinion on every idea, mostly technical, but also different things, and politics too. So I'm gonna start asking him some questions I recorded, and so that we get a perspective on where Bitcoin will go in future or something. So I'll start with this stupid tradition. Or foreign media sometimes does. They always ask me, so what about why Ukraine is listed as on the first place on the use of Bitcoin in the world? I never understand what it is about, so I'm always confused by this question. So I thought maybe you have a perspective traveling in different countries, why they say so, or it's like they say 25% of all Ukrainians use crypto. I'm not sure what they're talking about, but yeah, maybe you...
Well, I mean, Ukraine is full of smart people, and smart people use Bitcoin, so that's probably part of it. But, you know, in terms of day-to-day usage, I suspect El Salvador is higher. Because, you know, all the hype about El Salvador being a Bitcoin country and all that, it's, let's face it, it's not really true. It's a minority of transactions, but the fact is people actually do accept it. And, you know, I think one of the notable things in El Salvador is you can just walk around the cities and go see the Bitcoin ATMs, which are, a lot of them are run by the government. And there are lineups of people doing that. And meanwhile, here in Ukraine, I mean, are there even any Bitcoin ATMs in Kiev?
No, there is a bunch. Yeah.
Few, yeah. I mean, certainly you don't run into them like you do in El Salvador. So I think this is an example of media just not being correct. But in terms of ownership, yeah, I could imagine, you know, that being that high.
Peter refers to El Salvador accepted Bitcoin as a legal tender a couple of years ago. So they got rid of their own currency about 20 years ago. I think they switched to American dollar. And now they accept both dollar and Bitcoin as like regular payments. You can go to Starbucks and pay with Bitcoin for your coffee in El Salvador. That's like the first country did this 2 years ago, I think. And yeah, it is somehow, even though there is Bitcoin everywhere there, well, at least in some regions, I guess, it's still not listed that high on that list, which is probably has to do with the number of people living in El Salvador. But yeah, it's.
I mean, you know, Ukraine is a very big country. It wouldn't surprise me if the total number of people doing Bitcoin transactions is higher than El Salvador.
Yeah, that's true. The next question, do you think is the recipe for Bitcoin development in Ukraine and similar countries? I mean, what role Bitcoin will play in, say, in 5 years in economies like that and the political structures?
I mean, I think like, well, I mean, giving El Salvador again an example, I think one of the very interesting questions about Bitcoin is how much economic activity do you have across borders? Because, you know, one of the things Bitcoin does very well is getting rid of these barriers. And, you know, frankly, I suspect the reason why El Salvador politically adopted Bitcoin was in large part because they wanted to go and tell Western Union, screw you. And, you know, I mean, with my work in Bitcoin, of course, I wind up getting paid by clients all over the place. And from a practical point of view, I always want to be paid in Bitcoin. It's a lot less effort and a lot quicker to go deal with than things like wire transfers. You know, and like the fact is, it works really well for that. Now, you know, when I got into Bitcoin, you know, in fact, I should say, I mean, I tried to invent Bitcoin when I was in high school, and I will say I did fail at that. I'm not Satoshi, but you know, what interested me way back when in digital currency was obviously you need some way to send money over the internet. that's anonymous and decentralized if you're going to have real freedom of speech. Because the fact is, exercising freedom of speech in a useful way, to achieve real change in the world requires money. And it is very scary when you look at all the countries going around looking at, central bank digital currencies and trying to control that as much as possible. But, in terms of like what Ukraine specifically could use it for, I hate to say it, but, this will really depend on how Ukraine plays out politically, as you obviously will win the war. and I believe in that, but what sort of country does Ukraine become in 5 years? It's really hard to go say, and I think a lot of, that's really up to the hands of you guys and making sure Ukraine turns into a country I'd love to visit again and again.
Yeah, so far, I say that National Bank of Ukraine is a driver of Bitcoin adoption because they always enforce these restrictions, how much you can send your dollars for or whatever. So that might be different. But let's think that Ukraine moves towards the Western scenario. And so the question is then, how do you see Bitcoin used in the Western countries in 5 to 10 years? Is this because right now a big narrative in the US, for example, is inflation. The dollar is printed in a arbitrary way, and Bitcoin is kind of a way out of that, I guess, at least to some degree. And so in that sense, is that might be the main narrative in Europe, say, in 10 years, or what do you expect?
I mean, this might not be a very popular opinion in the Bitcoin world, but I kind of hope that Western countries are sane enough that we don't see inflation being a big driver of Bitcoin. Because, when you get down to it, that's really saying that your governments have completely failed. And worldwide, I think a lot of what drives Bitcoin adoption is government failure. One of the most interesting Bitcoin meetups I've ever had was a couple years ago in Kenya. And, here I am at a Bitcoin meetup in a place maybe a little less fancy than this. But, they go start off the Bitcoin meetup with a prayer to God, which is never seen that before. And you go talk to the people there. Sure enough, like half of them are farmers. Not, running like little operations, but running full-on industrial farms. Well, what does full-on industrial farms need? Well, they need to go import fertilizer, they need to go buy tractors, they need all this stuff coming in. Well, and how do they go do that in a screwed-up place like Kenya? Well, Bitcoin was actually really useful to go and get money across borders and not be exposed to inflation and all this stuff. And from their point of view, it's a very practical thing. Our governments is a failure. We need Bitcoin to be able to go and continue our businesses. And I would like to think that the US dollar doesn't hyperinflate away and destroy the lives of millions, but that is a possibility, and if that happens, we certainly could see enormous Bitcoin adoption on that.
Well, so do you imply that in successful countries, or in the countries where the ruling is adequate enough, Bitcoin doesn't matter? Or is it going to be used for gambling, or...
Well, I think the term doesn't matter. One of the things Bitcoin does is because it provides an alternative, it forces the competition to do better. In a place like El Salvador, the likes of Western Union are realizing, well, shoot, there's a limit to how much we can raise our fees because we do have a competitor. Now, does that mean, Bitcoin goes away or Western Union goes away? No, the chances are they'll coexist for the foreseeable future. But the existence of one means the other just has to do a better job. And when central banks go and look at other central banks have their role taken away by Bitcoin, that will force those remaining central banks say, well, shoot, there are limits to how much we can go steal money from people with inflation. Because like it or not, this isn't, I think this is a narrative that isn't spoken enough in economic circles, but inflation is a tax on savings. That is what it is economically. And there's a limit to how much you can go tax people before the economy collapses. And Bitcoin is something that, because it provides that competition, it reduces how far governments can go.
Well, we certainly talk about that narrative in our meetups. Do you see any interesting role of Bitcoin in international politics, like sanctions and all that stuff? How that will play out? Because so far we don't see any super obvious uses of Bitcoin in that direction. And yeah.
Well, there is a narrative of Bitcoin evades sanctions. Of course, Russia is a perfect example of that. But, A counter I'd make is, I mean, when you go look at how sanctions have been applied to, Russia's a great example, why is it that just now they're finally going and banning the export from Western countries like Canada and the US of a lot of obvious military goods to Russia? Like, the sanction issue, I think Bitcoin has very little to do with that, because it's obvious that the political will to apply sanctions, period, isn't there. And, it's just hilarious looking at this where, you're not even willing to go and cut off the flow of all this obvious stuff that shouldn't be shipped off to Russia on a big scale, and yet you're blaming Bitcoin for it. That's just a distraction. And, for most cases, I think worldwide where sanctions matter, what matters is physical goods. When you're looking at the flow of money, money itself doesn't do anything. I mean, the fact is, like, Bitcoin by itself is useless. Bitcoin's only useful if you can go do something with it, like convince someone to go accept it. And, well, what's the most likely thing Bitcoin flowing into countries that are kind of screwed up in the world's going to do? It's going to let people go leave. It's going to let people do things politically, internally. It's when we look at the countries who are trying the hardest right now to get rid of cash, it's not reasonably sane Western countries. I mean, Nigeria was the latest who took great efforts to abolish cash. Do you really think Nigeria is like an example of, democratic, wonderfully run country? No, it's a total mess. And by banning cash, it's one way that the government could go hold on to its remaining power. And Bitcoin fits into that role.
Yeah, I guess the most interesting example is with North Korea, how they presumably steal bitcoins off of exchanges and then try to sell it, but it's not that much. It's not even clear what it is about, and always confusing. Then they put that guy in jail. But that's if you Google North Korean crypto, there is a bunch of different stories. You might check it out. But even though both of us are kind of, I guess, open source developers and not businessmen, we still might think about what will be the next successful products on Bitcoin, like which Bitcoin services or Bitcoin native things one could build, and this might be interesting to someone. What do you think is interesting directions?
Well, again, like talking about the narrative competition, I mean, things like tipping on Nostra and whatnot. It's fascinating how you finally have.
We gotta tell what Nostra is.
So, I mean, basically speaking, Nostra is a decentralized protocol, well, somewhat decentralized, meant to go replace Twitter. I mean, there's a lot of nuance to what it is, but I think that covers it well enough. And one of the things people do on this, of course, is send each other money with Lightning. And Lightning is the first thing where you can actually send someone like a penny over the internet and not have all that money just eaten up in fees. I mean, for that matter, like, example I heard of was PayPal. Apparently, the actual cost for a single PayPal transaction, due to all the regulatory requirements and all the other stuff PayPal has to do, is like on the order of 10, 20 cents. Of course, it's possible to send someone a penny over PayPal. Like it just doesn't make any sense, and they're stuck because it's a centralized system and they have all these requirements. Whereas Bitcoin Lightning can actually do these things, and it's opened up a whole new way of doing business at these small scales. And maybe the closest comparison you can give to something that's existed before is things like micropayments with like SMS messages and so on. But they never really caught on in the way, precisely because you have all these central gatekeepers who say, well, you can't have access to the phone system, and you can't integrate this into your app. Whereas Lightning, anyone can go and just write some code and make it happen. I mean, I believe like tipping on Nostra, the most recent protocol change to do this, is something like 2 or 3 weeks old, and suddenly 1,000 people are using it. I mean, that's how fast things can go happen when you have decentralized protocols that actually work. And it's a very interesting time in Bitcoin to see all these pieces come together to the point where payments actually work cheaply. Obviously you needed that base layer of money that was secure and you could send, but to finally get Lightning happening is fascinating.
Yeah, at first I thought it's pretty cool how it works in Africa, where before Bitcoin or before crypto, they just used phone money, like whatever you top up on your phone, to pay at a store, you just send money from one phone to another, right? Because they have no banks. So that's a big narrative with the Bitcoin adoption.
Well, I mean, I wish I remember off the top of my head what the name of it was, but I mean, Kenya, they got a lot of good press for having, the first digital payment system like this. And it was quite funny when I visited Kenya, a couple of years ago, like talking to people who are actually familiar with how that tech really works. And they basically said, well, look, there's like one room literally where the computers that run this are, and if you take out that room, a big chunk of Kenya just collapses, because the actual technology behind this is terrible, absolutely terrible. But that's what you get without good protocols.
Yeah, I guess we gotta fill that space, and with in Ukraine, I always thought that we were kind of lucky to have this good banking system where they at least. Nobody trusts the banks, but at least the software is good and it's all nice until they prevent you from using dollars or whatever, and then it's all not working anymore. And now, last week I checked, they only allowed to withdraw, I don't know, $100 per one transaction, and that was like a daily limit or something. They lifted it now, but it's kind of painful at the war times. But anyway, yeah, let's move on. Do you have any specific thoughts on mining? Because that's what mining is. What people learn about Bitcoin first somehow. I don't know why here. It's like everybody has that friend with a mining rig in a garage from all times. Somebody did this to me in the hallway half an hour ago. So where do you think mining will be moving in the world or in the world politics? I guess.
I mean, the challenge with mining, of course, is that. Mining is this amazing example of a way to go turn electricity into money. And because of that, it has really moved to what is the cheapest possible sources of electricity. And currently, a lot of it is moving to things like flare gas. With many oil wells, oil happens to coincide with natural gas and other flammable gases. Well, if your oil well is in the middle of nowhere, there's no reasonable way to take that natural gas and pipe it somewhere useful. So previously, without Bitcoin, you just put up a pipe and set it on fire. And with Bitcoin, you can go run that into a turbine and turn into electricity and suddenly go and turn into Bitcoin. Well, why does it happen? Because that's nearly free electricity. I mean, the marginal cost to extract that is very little. And that's suddenly a huge thing the moment companies have gotten into this and realized it's an opportunity. Similarly, one of the other things that you see Bitcoin mining associated with is what's called stranded hydro. It's hydroelectric generation that you just don't have a market for. And for various reasons, there's a lot of stranded hydro in the world, and Bitcoin mines have been built near pretty much all this stuff.
That's a Chinese thing, right? Where mining was in China. So they had a lot of miners in the mountains where there is fast water streams, and at the daytime they can fuel the city, but when everybody goes to sleep, they cannot move this energy out anywhere because moving the energy is just too inefficient, and you lose everything on the way.
In fact, in China, I mean, of course, China, the government has got a long history of communism and mismanagement, and they did put a lot of hydroelectricity very far away from anything, and it was just totally useless. So, a bunch of Bitcoin miners popped up there. But I think, like in general, the challenge for the narrative, well, you just go mine Bitcoin, is fact is most of us do have fairly expensive power. I mean, we're lucky here, the power's on, period. But, and what can you do with that power? Well, you go turn it into heat. But unfortunately, for the Bitcoin world, heat pumps are very effective. Heat pump can go take multiple units of heat outside and bring it inside by moving it, like a refrigerator. So it's a tricky thing. I mean, some places Bitcoin mining will make sense, other places it won't.